Imagine a small village in northeastern France, Domrémy, nestled in a valley where the Meuse River winds its way through lush green pastures. It's the early 15th century, a time of turmoil for France, locked in a seemingly endless conflict with England, a struggle we now call the 100 Years' War. But here, in this quiet corner of the world, life for a young peasant girl named Joan seems simple, almost idyllic. She spends her days like any other child of her station, herding her father's sheep, learning to spin wool, and praying devoutly in the local church. She is pious, kind, but otherwise unremarkable, or so it seemed. One day, when Joan was about 13, something extraordinary happened. She was in her father's garden, a place of peace and solitude. Suddenly, a brilliant light, brighter than the midday sun, flooded her vision, and with the light came a voice. A voice that was both powerful and gentle, speaking to her from what she described as the direction of the church. At first, she was terrified. Who wouldn't be? But the voice was reassuring. It didn't demand anything grand, not yet. It simply told her to be a good girl and to go to church often. As time went on, the visitations became more frequent and the message grew clearer. The voice identified itself as Saint Michael the Archangel, the celestial protector of France. Soon, he was joined by others, Saint Catherine of Alexandria and Saint Margaret of Antioch, two virgin martyrs whom Joan deeply admired. These weren't just fleeting thoughts or daydreams. To Joan, they were real, tangible experiences. She saw them with her own eyes, heard them with her own ears, and even felt their presence. They became her counselors, her guides, her divine companions. The saints taught her about the dire state of her beloved France. They painted a grim picture of a kingdom torn apart, its people suffering under the heel of English invaders and their Burgundian allies. The rightful heir to the throne, the Dauphin Charles, was in hiding, too weak and demoralized to claim his crown. The great city of Orléans was under siege, a critical strategic point that, if it fell, would likely spell the end of French resistance. The heavenly voices told Joan that this suffering could not continue. France needed a savior. And then came the bombshell, the mission that would turn this peasant girl's world upside down. The voices told her that she, Joan, a young, illiterate girl from a remote village, was the one chosen by God to save France. Her mission was twofold. First, she was to travel to the besieged city of Orléans and lift the English siege. Second, she was to lead the Dauphin Charles to the city of Reims, the traditional site for coronations, and see him crowned King of France. Think about the sheer audacity of this command. A teenage girl, with no military training, no political influence, no knowledge of the world beyond her village, was being asked to command an army and crown a king. It was an impossible task, a ludicrous one by any earthly standard. Her family, especially her father Jacques d'Arc, was deeply protective and would never consent to such a dangerous and bizarre journey. He had even had nightmares that she would run away with soldiers. The local authorities would surely dismiss her as a mad woman. The journey itself was perilous, through lands swarming with enemy soldiers and bandits. For a long time, Joan kept these visions a secret, torn between her divine calling and the reality of her humble life. The voices were insistent, their urgings growing more and more pressing. Go, daughter of God, they would say, go to the aid of the King of France. They spoke of the pity God felt for the people of France. This resonated deeply with Joan. She wasn't driven by a lust for glory or power. She was moved by a profound compassion for her suffering countrymen. The stories of war and devastation that filtered into her village were no longer just distant news. They were a personal call to action. She began to understand that her simple, pious life was the very preparation she needed. Her unwavering faith was her shield, her humility her strength. Who else but someone with no worldly ambition could be trusted with such a divine task? The voices assured her that God would provide the means. They would guide her, protect her, and give her the words to say. She just needed to take the first step. She just needed to have faith. The internal conflict must have been immense. On one hand, there was the fear of failure, of ridicule, of leaving everything she had ever known. On the other, there was the undeniable power of the voices, the clarity of her mission, and a growing conviction that this was her destiny. She couldn't ignore the cries of her people or the command of her God. The peace of her childhood was over, replaced by a sense of divine, urgent purpose. Finally, after years of these celestial conversations, Joan made her choice. She would obey. The fear was still there, but her faith was stronger. She looked beyond the rolling hills of Domrémy, towards the heart of her broken kingdom. She knew what she had to do. Her first step was to find a way to reach the Dauphin Charles, who was holding court at his castle in Chinon. To do that, she would first have to convince the local commander at the nearby town of Vaucouleurs, a man named Robert de Baudricourt, to give her an escort. This was the first great test of her resolve. The humble shepherdess was about to embark on a journey that would change the course of history. She was no longer just Joan from Domrémy. She was becoming Joan the Maid, the messenger of God, ready to save France. Thank you for watching. If you're fascinated by this incredible story, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because in our next episode, we lines follow Joan as she takes her first defiant steps out of her village and into a world at war.
History isn't just what happened, it's what was hidden. Welcome to the Chrono Archives, where lost empires rise again, forgotten legends speak, and ancient truths are brought back to life. From world-shaping history and powerful myths to legendary rulers and timeless civilizations, every story here is carefully uncovered, deeply researched, and cinematically told. The past is calling, will you answer? Subscribe and journey through time, one unforgettable chronicle at a time.
Have you ever felt so strongly about something that you'd risk everything for it? I'm talking about leaving your home, your family, everything you've ever known, to chase a calling that nobody else understands. That's exactly what a teenage girl from a small village in France did, nearly 600 years ago. Her name was Joan, and this is the story of her incredible, almost impossible journey. Picture this, it's the early 15th century. France is a mess. It's been ravaged by the 100 Years' War with England for decades. The people are exhausted, morale is at an all-time low, and the future of the French crown hangs by a thread. The rightful heir, the Dauphin Charles, is in hiding, too afraid and too weak to claim his throne. The country is fractured, with huge chunks of it under English and Burgundian control. Hope is a luxury most people can't afford. In the middle of all this chaos, in a little village called Domrémy, lives a young peasant girl named Joan. From the outside, she's just like any other girl her age. But on the inside, something extraordinary is happening. For years, she says she's been hearing voices of saints. She calls them Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. These aren't just whispers. They're divine commands. They've given her a mission that sounds absolutely insane: to save France. She, an uneducated teenage girl who's never held a sword, is supposed to drive out the English and ensure the Dauphin is crowned king. Imagine the courage it took for her to even speak this out loud, but she did. Her first step was to convince a local commander, Robert de Baudricourt, to help her. As you can guess, he basically laughed her out of the room. A peasant girl leading an army, it was preposterous. He told her family to take her home and give her a good spanking. But Joan was relentless. She didn't give up. She stayed, her conviction unwavering, telling anyone who would listen about her divine mission. Her persistence started to make an impression. It wasn't just what she said, but how she said it. There was a fire in her eyes, a certainty in her voice that was hard to ignore. She even made a startlingly accurate prediction about a French defeat near Orléans, which came true. This was the turning point. Suddenly, people weren't just laughing, they were listening. The townspeople, and even some of Baudricourt's own soldiers, started to believe that maybe, just maybe, this girl was for real. Maybe she was the prophesied maiden who would save France. Finally, Baudricourt caved. He was either convinced or just tired of her bugging him, but either way, he agreed to give her an escort. He gave her a horse and a small group of soldiers. Now, think about this journey. They had to travel over 300 miles from Vaucouleurs to Chinon, where the Dauphin was holding his court. And this wasn't a leisurely road trip. The entire route was through hostile territory, swarming with English and Burgundian patrols. It was incredibly dangerous. For her own safety, Joan cut her hair short and dressed in man-esque clothing, a practical decision that would later be used against her. For 11 long days, this small band of travelers rode mostly at night, avoiding major roads and towns, sleeping in fields. The soldiers traveling with her were initially skeptical, of course. Who wouldn't be? But day by day, as they witnessed her unshakable faith and her simple, profound piety, their skepticism turned into awe, and then into fierce loyalty. They saw that she wasn't seeking fame or fortune. Her determination was pure. She prayed constantly, and her spirit seemed to lift everyone around her. They began to see her not as a crazy girl, but as a true messenger of God. Word of her journey started to spread like wildfire. Whispers turned into excited chatter in the towns and villages she passed. A peasant girl, sent by God, on her way to save the king. It was the kind of story that a war-weary, desperate population was hungry for. She became a symbol of hope before she'd even swung a single sword. For the first time in a long time, people felt a flicker of optimism. Finally, after this grueling and perilous trek, they arrived at the imposing fortress of Chinon. This was it, the moment of truth. She had made it to the Dauphin's court. But getting here was the easy part. Now, she had to face a court full of cynical, scheming nobles and, most importantly, she had to convince a weak, indecisive, and deeply paranoid Dauphin that she was his last, best hope. The court at Chinon was a snake pit of political intrigue. The Dauphin Charles was surrounded by advisors who were more interested in their own power than in the fate of France. When they heard a peasant girl claiming to have a divine mission was at the gates, they were deeply suspicious. Was she a fraud, a witch, a political pawn sent by one of their rivals? They weren't about to let some farm girl waltz in and meet the future king, so they decided to test her. According to legend, when Joan was finally granted an audience, the Dauphin, Charles, disguised himself by dressing as a common courtier and hiding in the crowd. The grand hall was filled with hundreds of richly dressed nobles. How could an uneducated girl from a tiny village possibly pick out the one man she had never seen before? But as Joan walked into the hall, her eyes scanned the crowd. She walked past all the decoys, all the splendidly dressed lords, and went straight to the plainly dressed, unassuming Charles. She knelt before him and said, "God give you a good life, gentle Dauphin." He denied it, saying, "I am not the king. He is over there," pointing to another man. But Joan was firm. "In God's name, gentle prince, it is you and no other." To further prove her mission was genuine, she then reportedly told him a secret, something only he and God could know. It was a secret about a private prayer he had made, a prayer born of his deepest doubts about his own legitimacy and his ability to rule. We don't know exactly what she said, but whatever it was, it shook Charles to his core. His face went pale. The test was over. In that moment, the Dauphin's doubt began to melt away, replaced by a dawning belief. This single event was the critical turning point. Joan had not only physically traveled across a dangerous country, but she had also crossed the immense social chasm between a peasant and a future king. She had faced down mockery, doubt, and political games, and she had won them over not with power or threats, but with the sheer force of her conviction. But convincing the Dauphin was just one hurdle. Before he could officially endorse her, Charles's advisors insisted on one more examination. He sent Joan to the city of Poitiers to be questioned by a panel of high-ranking theologians and churchmen. For 3 weeks, these learned men grilled her. They interrogated her about her voices, her faith, her intentions. They were looking for any hint of heresy, any crack in her story, Imagine the pressure. A young, uneducated girl facing a battery of the most educated men in the kingdom. But Joan answered them with a simple, disarming honesty and a wisdom that seemed beyond her years. When one of them asked her in a thick regional accent what language her voices spoke, she replied, "A better one than yours." When they asked her for a sign, a miracle to prove her claims, she famously said, "In God's name, I have not come to Poitiers to give signs, but take me to Orléans, and I will show you the sign for which I have been sent." In the end, the theologians could find no fault in her. They declared that they found nothing but good in her: humility, virginity, devotion, honesty, simplicity. They concluded that, given the desperate state of the kingdom, the Dauphin would be wise to not dismiss her. Their report essentially gave Charles the green light. The final barrier was removed. Joan had done it. She had left her home as an unknown girl with a seemingly impossible dream. She had traveled across a war-torn country, faced down disbelief, and won over soldiers, commoners, and now the royal court and the church. She was about to be given her chance to fulfill her destiny. Charles, now filled with a newfound sense of purpose, agreed to her request. He would give her an army. He had a suit of white armor custom-made for her, and she was given a banner that she designed herself, depicting Jesus and Mary against a field of lilies. The girl from Domrémy was no longer just Joan the peasant. She was becoming Joan the maid, the warrior sent by God to lead the armies of France. Her next stop was the besieged city of Orléans, where she would finally show the world the sign she had promised. The fate of France rested on her young shoulders. Thank you so much for watching this chapter of Joan's incredible story. If you're as captivated by her journey as I am, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next part, where we head into the thick of battle at Orléans. What do you find most inspiring about her journey so far? Let me know in the comments below. See you next time. So Joan of Arc, this teenage girl claiming to hear voices from God, finally gets her meeting with the future King of France, the Dauphin Charles. But this isn't going to be a simple meet and greet. The royal court at Chinon Castle is a snake pit of skepticism and political games. Charles's advisors, the nobles, the clergy, they all think she's either a fraud, a lunatic, or a political pawn sent by their enemies. Charles himself is weak-willed and deeply insecure, surrounded by people who constantly question his legitimacy. He's desperate for a miracle, but he's also terrified of being made a fool. So, they decide to test her. The scene is set for a major showdown. The great hall of the castle is packed with courtiers, all dressed in their finest. The air is thick with tension and whispered gossip. The plan is simple, almost childishly so. Charles will disguise himself, dressing down and hiding amongst the crowd of nobles. Another courtier will be put on the throne, pretending to be the Dauphin. If Joan is truly sent by God, they reason, she'd be able to see through the deception. It's a high-stakes gamble. If she fails, she'd be laughed out of Chinon, her mission over before it even began. Joan enters the hall. Imagine it, a young peasant girl, probably overwhelmed by the sheer opulence and the hundreds of judging eyes fixed on her. The candlelight glints off silks and jewels. She walks past the man on the throne without a second glance. Her eyes scan the crowd, moving with a strange, otherworldly confidence. Then, she stops. She walks directly to a plainly dressed man standing in the back. It's Charles. She kneels before him. The hall falls silent. You could hear a pin drop. She looks up at him and says, "Gentle Dauphin, I have come and I am sent by God to bring help to you and the kingdom." Charles is completely stunned. He tries to deny it, pointing to the man on the throne, saying, "I am not the king. He is over there." But Joan is unwavering. "In God's name, gentle prince," she insists, "it is you and no other." This moment sends a shock wave through the court. How could she have known? Some see it as a divine sign, a true miracle. Others, the more cynical ones, whisper that she was tipped off, that it's all just a clever trick. The test isn't over. In fact, it's just beginning. Charles, though impressed and maybe a little spooked, can't just hand over his army to a teenage girl based on one parlor trick, no matter how convincing. The political stakes are too high, so he pulls Joan aside for a private conversation. This is where the story gets even more incredible. We don't know the exact words spoken between them, as it was a closely guarded secret. But legends and historical accounts tell us that Joan revealed something to Charles that only he and God could possibly know. What was this secret? Historians have debated it for centuries. The most popular theory is that she told him the details of a private prayer he had made to God, a prayer where he questioned his own legitimacy, wondering if he was truly the son of the former king and the rightful heir to the throne. This was his deepest, most private insecurity. For Joan to know this was impossible by any normal means. It was proof, for him, that her knowledge came from a divine source. When Charles emerges from that private meeting, his entire demeanor has changed. The doubt is gone, replaced by a glimmer of hope. But his advisors are still not convinced. They're churchmen and scholars, and they demand a more formal examination. So, for the next 3 weeks, Joan is subjected to an intense theological interrogation by a panel of high-ranking clergy and university doctors in the nearby city of Poitiers. These aren't simple questions. They grill her on the nature of her visions, the details of her faith, and the soundness of her theology. They are looking for any hint of heresy, any crack in her story that would prove she's a witch or a heretic. They ask her for a sign, a miracle, to prove her mission is from God. Joan's responses are legendary for their simplicity and unshakable faith. When they demand a sign, she replies, "In God's name, I have not come to Poitiers to give signs, but take me to Orléans, and I will show you the sign for which I have been sent." She cleverly turns their challenge back on them. The proof, she argues, won't be found in a debating chamber, but on the battlefield. Her sign will be the victory she promises to deliver. Her examiners are stumped. They can find no heresy in her words. Her piety is genuine, her answers sharp and disarmingly direct. She's just a simple girl, yet she holds her own against the most educated men in the kingdom. They can't prove she's a fraud, but they can't fully endorse her either. Their final report to Charles is cautious. They conclude that they found nothing but good in her, and no evil, and that given the desperate state of the kingdom, the Dauphin would be wise to not dismiss her help. This is the green light Charles was waiting for. It's a political sidestep, but it's enough. He's personally convinced by her secret, and his theological experts haven't forbidden it. The gamble is now worth taking. He makes a decision that will change the course of French history. He orders that Joan of Arc be equipped for war. A suit of white armor is custom-made for her. She is given a banner, emblazoned with the names of Jesus and Mary, and most importantly, she is given command of an army. The peasant girl from Domrémy is now a warrior, the leader of a military relief force. Her destination, the city of Orléans, which has been under a brutal siege by the English for months and is on the brink of surrender. This is the moment everything becomes real. The voices, the visions, the long journey, the tests, it has all led to this. Joan's personal quest has now merged with the fate of a nation. For the demoralized French soldiers and the terrified citizens of Orléans, her arrival is seen as a divine intervention, a last hope in their darkest hour. The stage is set for one of the most astonishing campaigns in military history. The Maid of Orléans is about to ride into legend. Picture this, it's 1429. The city of Orléans is on its last legs. For over 6 months, it's been choked by an English siege. The air is thick with the smell of gunpowder and despair. The people are starving, the soldiers are demoralized, and the once proud French city is about to fall. Surrender seems inevitable. The 100 Years' War is tipping decisively in England's favor, and the future of France hangs by a thread. But then, a whisper of hope arrives. A 17-year-old peasant girl, clad in shining armor, is coming. On April 29th, a small convoy snakes its way towards the besieged city. At its head, riding a white horse, is Joan of Arc. She isn't just carrying supplies, she's carrying the hopes of a nation. Her white banner, painted with images of Jesus and Mary, flutters in the wind, a symbol of divine purpose in a world of earthly conflict. As she rides through the gates of Orléans, something incredible happens. The mood of the city, once heavy with dread, instantly electrifies. The weary citizens pour into the streets, not just to see this strange girl in armor, but to touch her, to be near her. They see her not as a mere soldier, but as a savior, an angel sent by God. It's a moment of pure, unadulterated hope. The French commanders, seasoned veterans like Jean de Dunois, are skeptical. They've been fighting this war their whole lives. What can one teenage girl possibly do that they haven't already tried? They see her as a mascot, a morale booster, but not a true military leader. They suggest caution, defensive tactics, waiting for reinforcements, but Joan is having none of it. She didn't come to Orleans to wait, she came to fight. Her conviction is absolute, her energy infectious. She speaks to the soldiers not as a commander barking orders, but as one of them, sharing their faith and their cause. She insists that God is on their side, and that victory is not just possible, but promised. Joan immediately gets to work. She mixes with the soldiers, prays with them, and shares their meager rations. She forbids swearing and insists they attend Mass. This isn't just about discipline, it's about transforming the army's soul. She's turning a band of demoralized mercenaries into a holy crusade. The soldiers, who had all but given up, start to believe again. They see her piety, her unwavering courage, and they start to think, maybe, just maybe, she's the real deal. Her presence is a fire that reignites their fighting spirit. Her first real test comes at the fortress of St. Loup, one of the key English strongholds surrounding the city. While the French commanders hesitate, Joan takes the initiative. She rallies the troops and leads the charge herself, banner in hand. The French soldiers, inspired by her fearlessness, fight with a ferocity the English haven't seen in months. The fortress falls. It's a small victory, but its impact is immense. It proves that the English are not invincible. It proves that Joan's strategy of aggressive, faith-fueled attacks can work. The momentum begins to shift. Next, she targets the Augustins' fortress, another critical English position. The battle is fierce, a chaotic mess of steel and stone. The French commanders are still wary, but they can't deny the results. Joan is always at the forefront, a beacon of courage in the thick of the fighting. She seems to be everywhere at once, shouting encouragement, directing troops, and shaming those who hang back. The Augustins falls, too. The noose around Orleans is loosening, one fortress at a time. The English, who had been so confident, are now rattled. Who is this girl? This maid, as they call her, who fights with such divine fury. The climax of the siege arrives on May 7th, at the Tourelles, the main English fortress guarding the bridge into the city. This is the linchpin of the entire siege. Taking it seems impossible. The fortress is heavily fortified, defended by England's best soldiers. The assault begins at dawn. The French throw everything they have at the walls, but the English defenses are brutal and effective. The fighting is hand-to-hand, bloody, and desperate. In the midst of the chaos, disaster strikes. As Joan climbs a scaling ladder, an English archer takes aim. A crossbow bolt pierces her shoulder, a wound 6 inches deep. She cries out in pain and falls. The French soldiers falter. Their divine protector is wounded, perhaps fatally. It seems the miracle is over. Panic begins to set in. The English on the walls roar in triumph. The assault is on the verge of collapse, but Joan is not done. She pulls the bolt out herself, has the wound quickly dressed with olive oil and lard, and refuses to leave the field. She retreats for a moment to a nearby vineyard to pray. The French commanders, seeing her wounded and the assault failing, decide to call it a day. The retreat is sounded, but as the French begin to fall back, Joan remounts her horse. She grabs her banner and rides back towards the fortress alone, telling her standard-bearer to watch her banner. When the banner touches the wall, she cries, "It is yours." Seeing her return to the fight, wounded but unbroken, her banner held high, a massive surge of adrenaline and belief washes over the French army. They let out a great shout and turn, charging back towards the walls with a renewed, almost manic, energy. This sight terrifies the English. They had seen her fall, they thought she was dead. To them, it looks as if she has been resurrected before their very eyes. Is she a witch, an angel? They don't know, but they are suddenly filled with a supernatural dread. Their morale shatters, the French swarm over the walls, and the Tourelles falls. The English forces are routed, their commander drowned in the river Loire. The siege is broken. In just a few days, a 17-year-old girl accomplished what the entire French army couldn't do in over 6 months. On May 8th, the English army abandons its remaining positions and retreats. The Siege of Orléans is over, the city is free. The citizens erupt in a delirious celebration that would be repeated every year for centuries to come. They parade Joan through the streets, hailing her as their liberator, their Pucelle d'Orléans, the Maid of Orleans. This victory is more than just a military triumph. It's a profound psychological turning point. For the French, it's undeniable proof. This girl isn't just lucky or charismatic. She is divinely inspired. Her victory at Orléans sends a shockwave across France, convincing nobles, soldiers, and commoners alike that God is truly on their side. And for the Dauphin Charles, still uncrowned and hiding in his court, the news is a revelation. The seemingly impossible has happened. The girl he sent to Orléans in a desperate gamble has delivered a miracle. Now, he must confront a new reality. Joan of Arc might just be the key to his crown and to the salvation of France itself. The road to Reims was now open. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as incredible as I do, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more epic tales from history. The war council was a tense affair. The English were dug in, their positions strong. The French commanders, veterans of defeat, urged caution, a slow, methodical approach, but Joan wasn't having any of it. To her, this wasn't just a military campaign, it was a divine mandate. The voices she heard, the visions she saw, all pointed to one singular, non-negotiable goal: getting Charles to Reims to be crowned king. She argued with an unshakable conviction that left the seasoned generals stunned. She wasn't just suggesting a strategy, she was declaring God's will. Hesitation, she claimed, was a sin against heaven itself. And so, against all conventional military wisdom, the march began. The journey to Reims was nothing short of miraculous. It was a spear thrust deep into English-held territory, a path lined with fortified towns and enemy garrisons. The first major obstacle was Troyes. The city's gates were shut, its walls manned by a formidable Anglo-Burgundian force. A siege seemed inevitable, a long, drawn-out affair that would bleed the French army of its momentum and supplies. For days, the French commanders debated, their confidence waning. Their food was running out, and the soldiers' morale was beginning to crack, but Joan remained a beacon of certainty. She organized the army, personally placing artillery and leading prayers. She rode around the city walls, her banner held high, a figure of pure, unwavering faith. Her presence was electrifying. She promised them victory, not in weeks or months, but in days. It's said she told them to prepare for an assault, but before the attack could even begin, something incredible happened. The leaders of Troyes, intimidated by her reputation and perhaps unnerved by her sheer force of will, sent out envoys to negotiate. The city surrendered without a single drop of blood being shed. This victory sent shockwaves through the region. Town after town along the route seemed to melt away before the advancing French army. Chalons, and then others, opened their gates, their citizens cheering for the Maid and their Dauphin. What would have been a brutal, months-long military slog turned into a triumphant procession. It was as if Joan wasn't just conquering lands, she was liberating hearts and minds. The English and their Burgundian allies, who had held this territory for years, seemed powerless to stop the tide. Their commanders were bewildered. How could a teenage girl with no military training orchestrate such a stunning and rapid advance? For the French soldiers and the common folk, the answer was simple. God was on their side, and Joan was his instrument. Finally, on the 16th of July, 1429, the royal procession reached the ancient city of Reims. This was the traditional site for the coronation of French kings, a place steeped in history and religious significance. The air was thick with anticipation. The city's inhabitants poured into the streets, desperate to catch a glimpse of the Dauphin and the young woman who had led them here against all odds. Flowers rained down from windows, and banners bearing the fleur-de-lis fluttered from every building. This wasn't just a military victory, it was a spiritual and national rebirth. For a country that had known only division and defeat for a generation, this was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. Charles, who had been timid and uncertain for so long, now rode with a newfound confidence, the weight of his destiny finally settling comfortably on his shoulders. The next day, July 17th, the great doors of the Reims Cathedral swung open. The interior was a breathtaking spectacle of Gothic architecture, its vaulted ceilings reaching towards the heavens, stained glass windows casting colorful patterns on the stone floor. The air was heavy with the scent of incense. French nobles, clergy in their finest vestments, and knights in polished armor filled the pews. At the heart of it all stood Charles, ready to claim his birthright. And right there beside him, holding her white banner, was Joan. She was given a place of honor, a recognition of her singular role in making this day possible. She wasn't a noble, she wasn't royalty, but in that moment, she was the soul of France. The Archbishop of Reims performed the ancient rites. The sacred oil, believed to have been brought from heaven to anoint the first Christian king of the Franks, was used to consecrate Charles. As the crown was placed upon his head, a cheer erupted from the assembled crowd, a sound that echoed through the massive cathedral and out into the streets of the city. Charles was no longer the Dauphin, the disputed heir. He was now King Charles VII of France, his legitimacy affirmed in the eyes of God and man. At that moment, Joan wept. According to those present, they were tears of joy and fulfillment. She knelt before her newly crowned king, her mission seemingly complete. She had done what she had promised, she had driven back the English and seen her king crowned. The coronation was the absolute peak of Joan's career. It was the fulfillment of the divine prophecy she had carried since her days in Domrémy. For many, this should have been the end of her story. She had accomplished the impossible, secured her place in history, and could have retired as a national hero. But for Joan, the fight wasn't over. The voices hadn't fallen silent. While the coronation had secured Charles's legitimacy, vast swaths of France, including the capital city of Paris, remained under English control. In the halls of power, the king's advisors, ever the pragmatists, began talking of diplomacy, of truces, of consolidating their gains. They saw the coronation as a powerful bargaining chip. Joan saw it differently. To her, a truce with the English was a betrayal of God's will. The mission wasn't just to crown a king. It was to drive the English out of France entirely. She was a warrior, not a diplomat. While the royal court celebrated and schemed, Joan was restless. Her purpose, as she saw it, was not yet complete. She believed that the momentum was with them, that Paris itself was within their grasp. She urged the king to march on the capital immediately, to press their advantage while the English were still reeling. This put her in direct conflict with the more cautious and politically minded members of the court, men who were now growing wary of her influence. They saw her as a useful tool that had served its purpose, but Joan saw herself as something more. The stage was set for a new chapter, one that would move from the sacred halls of Reims to the bloody battlements of Paris. Her greatest triumph was behind her, but her greatest trials were still to come. The girl who had crowned a king now wanted to liberate a nation, and she would let nothing, and no one, stand in her way. Previously, we saw Joan at the absolute peak of her power, standing beside Charles as he was crowned King of France in Reims Cathedral. It was a moment of pure triumph, the culmination of a miraculous campaign. But as we all know, what goes up must come down. And for Joan, the fall from grace would be as swift and brutal as her rise was meteoric. The coronation should have been the start of a new, unified push to drive the English out of France for good. That's certainly what Joan believed. She was a soldier, pure and simple. For her, the mission wasn't over until every last English soldier was off French soil. She urged King Charles, pleaded with him, to let her press the advantage and march on Paris, the English-held capital. The momentum was on their side, the army was fired up, and the English were reeling. It was the perfect time to strike, but war is never just about what happens on the battlefield. It's also about politics, money, and power. And inside the newly crowned king's court, the mood was shifting. King Charles VII was not a warrior like Joan. He was a cautious, indecisive man who preferred diplomacy and negotiation to the uncertainties of battle. Now that he had his crown, his main goal was to consolidate his power and enjoy the comforts of being king, a long, expensive war to capture Paris. That didn't sound very comfortable. He wasn't alone in his thinking. The king's court was filled with powerful nobles and advisors who had been skeptical of Joan from the beginning. They were jealous of her influence over the king. They were suspicious of this peasant girl who claimed to hear voices from God. They whispered in Charles's ear, planting seeds of doubt. She's getting too powerful, they'd say her luck will run out. Let's make a truce with the English, secure what we've won. One of the most influential of these figures was Georges de la Tremouille, the king's chief advisor. He saw Joan not as a savior, but as a threat to his own position and wealth. He actively worked to undermine her, pushing for truces and negotiations that he knew would stall her military campaign. Even the army, which had once followed Joan with unquestioning devotion, was starting to show signs of strain. The soldiers were exhausted. They had been fighting non-stop, and the promised pay and supplies from the royal court were often late or never arrived at all. Victories were still happening, but they were smaller, harder fought, and the sense of divine inevitability was fading. Doubt began to creep in. Was God still with them? Or had their luck simply run out? Joan, fueled by her divine mission, was blind to the political games being played around her. She saw hesitation as cowardice and diplomacy as betrayal. She couldn't understand why Charles wouldn't just trust in God and finish the job. Against the court's advice, she pushed for an assault on Paris in September 1429. It was a disaster. The attack was poorly planned and under-supported by the king. Joan herself was wounded in the thigh by a crossbow bolt as she tried to rally the troops. Lying in the ditch outside the city walls, she still urged her men to fight on, but the retreat was called. The attack had failed. This failure was exactly the ammunition Joan's enemies needed. They pointed to the defeat as proof that her miracle was over. See, they told the king, she is not invincible. Her voices have misled her. The failed siege of Paris shattered Joan's aura of invincibility. It was the first major check on her incredible run of success, and it gave the king and his court the perfect excuse to sideline her. Charles ordered the army to disband for the winter and pulled back to the Loire Valley, effectively ending the campaign for the year. He even began pursuing a truce with the Duke of Burgundy, an ally of the English, which completely went against Joan's strategy of total war. Joan was given minor tasks, clearing out mercenary bands in the countryside, but she was kept far from the king's inner circle. The royal protection and resources that had been so crucial to her success were slowly being withdrawn. She was no longer the centerpiece of the French war effort. She was becoming a political inconvenience. Imagine her frustration. She had delivered a king, his crown had turned the tide of a 100-year war, and now she was being treated like a glorified pest controller while the men in power negotiated away the victories she had won in blood. Her divine voices still urged her forward, telling her the mission was not complete. She spent the winter and spring of 1430 in a state of agonizing limbo, watching as the political situation worsened and her influence waned. By May of 1430, Joan couldn't stand it any longer. She learned that the city of Compiègne, which had declared its allegiance to Charles, was under siege by Burgundian forces. This was a direct threat to the lands she had helped liberate. Without seeking the king's permission, without his official backing or a royal army, she gathered a small band of loyal soldiers and rode to the city's defense. This was a turning point. For the first time, Joan was acting not as the commander of the French army, but as a rogue captain. She was operating outside the chain of command, defying the king she had crowned. It was an act of incredible bravery, but also of immense desperation. She was riding into battle without the protection of the crown, without the resources of the state. She was risking everything, armed only with her faith and the loyalty of a few good men. She was putting her life on the line not just against the English and Burgundians, but against the indifference of her own king. As she rode towards Compiègne, she was riding towards her destiny, a destiny that would be sealed outside the city walls. Joan, abandoned by the court but not by her mission, makes one last defiant stand. What happens at Compiègne will change everything. The spring of 1430 was a tense and fragile time for France. The victories Joan had secured were monumental, but the war was far from over. The English and their Burgundian allies still held vast territories, including the strategic prize of Paris. It was against this backdrop that the city of Compiègne, loyal to King Charles, found itself under siege by a formidable Burgundian army led by Duke Philip the Good. For Joan, this was an unacceptable threat. Compiègne was a vital stronghold, and its fall would be a devastating blow to the French cause. Without hesitation, she gathered a small force of a few hundred soldiers and raced to the city's defense, arriving under the cover of darkness on the morning of May 23rd. The mood inside Compiègne was a mixture of relief and anxiety. The sight of Joan, their celestial champion, certainly bolstered morale. But looking out from the fortress walls, the sheer scale of the Burgundian encampment was daunting. They were surrounded, yet Joan was never one for passive defense. She believed in taking the fight to the enemy, in seizing the initiative. She was convinced that a bold, surprise attack could break the siege before it truly began. That same evening, she decided to lead a sortie, a daring raid against a Burgundian position on the far side of the Oise River, hoping to catch them off guard. As the sun began to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows across the battlefield, Joan mounted her horse. Clad in her gleaming white armor, she was an icon of courage, a beacon of hope for the soldiers who followed her. They charged out from the city gates, thundering across the causeway that spanned the river. The initial assault was a success. They crashed into the Burgundian forward camp, creating chaos and confusion. For a moment, it seemed like her trademark audacity would once again carry the day. But the Burgundians were a disciplined and experienced force. They quickly recovered from the initial shock. Suddenly, the tide of the battle turned. What started as a surprise attack became a desperate fight for survival. English reinforcements, who had been secretly positioned nearby, surged forward, cutting off the French line of retreat. The small French force was now horribly outnumbered, caught in a pincer movement. Panic began to set in. The cry went up to fall back, to get back to the safety of Compiègne's walls. Joan, always leading from the rear during a retreat to protect her men, found herself at the very back of the frantic withdrawal. The scene at the city gates was one of pure chaos. Soldiers scrambled to get inside as a hail of arrows rained down. The governor of Compiègne, watching the unfolding disaster from the ramparts, made a fateful, heart-wrenching decision. Fearing that the enemy would storm the gate and take the city, he ordered it to be razed. The heavy portcullis began its slow, grinding descent, sealing the fortress. For Joan and the handful of soldiers still trapped outside, it was a death sentence. There was nowhere left to run. She fought fiercely, a cornered lioness, but it was hopeless. A Burgundian archer grabbed onto the back of her flowing surcoat and pulled her from her horse. She tumbled to the ground, surrounded by enemy soldiers. The fight was over. The Maid of Orleans, the woman who had turned the tide of the 100 Years' War, was a captive. For the Burgundians, it was an unimaginable prize. They knew exactly who they had. This wasn't just any prisoner of war. This was the symbol of French resistance. News of her capture spread like wildfire. To the French, it was a catastrophe, a moment of national despair. To the English and Burgundians, it was a cause for wild celebration. They had captured the witch, the heretic who had humiliated their armies. Joan was first taken to the castle of Jean de Luxembourg, the Burgundian captain whose soldier had captured her. From there, a sordid and drawn-out negotiation began. She was a valuable commodity, and everyone knew it. The English wanted her more than anything. They saw her not just as a military threat, but as a spiritual and ideological one. To them, she was an instrument of the devil, and her public condemnation was essential to delegitimize Charles VII's coronation and demoralize the French. They were willing to pay any price. For months, Joan was held captive by the Burgundians as the English put immense political and financial pressure on Duke Philip. Eventually, a deal was struck. For the staggering sum of 10,000 livres terroir, a king's ransom, the Burgundians sold Joan of Arc to the English. She was handed over to her most bitter enemies, the very people she had fought so relentlessly to drive from her homeland. They transported her to the city of Rouen, the headquarters of the English occupation in Normandy. There, she was imprisoned in a dark, cold tower, chained and guarded day and night. Her fate was now sealed. She was no longer a soldier on a battlefield, but a prisoner facing a trial orchestrated by men who had already decided her guilt. The stage was being set for the final, tragic act of her life, her trial and martyrdom. Thank you so much for watching. If you're fascinated by this incredible story, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into history's most pivotal moments. We'll see you in the next one. Imagine being 19 years old, standing alone in a dark, intimidating room, surrounded by dozens of powerful men who have already decided you are guilty. This was the reality for Joan of Arc. After her incredible victories, Joan was captured by her enemies and sold to the English. Her fate would be decided, not on a battlefield, but in a courtroom where the verdict was a foregone conclusion. This is the story of her trial, a trial by fire. The year is 1431. Joan is imprisoned in Rouen, a city under English control. She's not treated as a prisoner of war, which she was by all rights. Instead, she's thrown into a secular prison, guarded by English soldiers, a violation of church law, which dictated she should be in a church prison guarded by nuns. From the very beginning, the rules were bent and broken to ensure her conviction. The trial began on February 21st, led by Bishop Pierre Coquin, a man with a deep-seated grudge against Joan and a powerful allegiance to the English. He assembled a court of theologians, scholars, and lawyers, all carefully selected for their pro-English and anti-Joan sentiments. They accused her of heresy, witchcraft, sorcery, and, strangely enough, of wearing men's clothing. Joan, an illiterate peasant girl, had no lawyer, no one to advise her. She stood alone against a hostile assembly of the most educated men in France. They expected a quick confession, an easy victory. What they got was a masterclass in courage and wit. For months, Joan was subjected to relentless public and private interrogations. The judges tried every trick in the book to trap her. They peppered her with complex theological questions, hoping she would slip up and incriminate herself. One of the most famous exchanges went something like this. A judge asked her, "Joan, do you know if you are in God's grace?" If she said no, she'd be admitting her own guilt. "And if I am, may God so keep me." The court was stunned into silence. A peasant girl had just outsmarted a room full of scholars. When they pressed her about her saints, Michael, Catherine, and Margaret, she spoke of them with unwavering faith, describing their voices and the comfort they gave her. She insisted her mission came from God, not the devil. The charge of cross-dressing was particularly pushed by the court. To them, her male armor and clothing were an abomination, a defiance of divine law. For Joan, it was a matter of practicality and protection. It allowed her to blend in with soldiers and, more importantly, it protected her from assault by her male guards in prison. Her armor was a symbol of her mission, her simple male attire in prison was a shield. But the court twisted it into a symbol of heresy. Despite her brilliant defense, the trial was a sham. The entire process was designed not to find the truth, but to legitimize a politically motivated execution. They needed to discredit her to discredit the king she had crowned, Charles VII. If Joan was a heretic, then Charles's crown was illegitimate, a gift from a devil worshipper. The pressure on Joan was immense. She was kept in chains, threatened with torture, and psychologically tormented day and night. She grew physically ill from the conditions and the stress, but her spirit, though tested, refused to break. In late May, after months of this ordeal, she was taken to the cemetery of Saint-Ouen. A pyre was set up. She was shown the executioner and told that, if she did not recant, she would be burned immediately. Faced with the immediate, terrifying prospect of death by fire, and likely exhausted and ill, Joan finally faltered. She signed a document of abjuration, a confession, with a simple cross, as she couldn't write her name. Her sentence was commuted to life in prison. But this was just another cruel trick. A few days later, the judges returned to her cell to find her once again in men's clothing. What happened is a matter of debate. When asked why she had relapsed, Joan's defiance had returned. She told the judges that she had only recanted out of fear of the fire, and that her visions were true and from God. This was exactly what Cocken and the English needed. By their own twisted logic, she was now a relapsed heretic. The first offense might have earned her mercy, but a second was unforgivable. There would be no more chances, no more appeals. The verdict was swift and final. On May 29, 1431, the court declared Joan of Arc a relapsed heretic. The sentence was announced: execution. The next morning, she would be taken to the old market square in Rouen and burned at the stake. But in that courtroom, facing down her accusers with unwavering courage, Joan secured a different kind of victory. She couldn't save her own life, but she cemented her legacy as a symbol of defiance, faith, and unbreakable will. Thank you for watching. If you found this story as compelling as I do, please hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the lives of history's most incredible figures. See you next time. Welcome back to our journey through the incredible life of Joan of Arc. Today, we arrive at the final, most heartbreaking chapter of her story, her martyrdom. This isn't just an ending, it's a transformation, the moment a young woman became an eternal symbol of faith and courage. The year is 1431, the place, the bustling old marketplace of Rouen, in English-held Normandy. But on this day, May 30th, the usual sounds of trade and chatter are replaced by a heavy, somber silence. A large pyre, a stake of wood, stands ominously in the center, waiting. The air is thick with dread and anticipation. Thousands of people have gathered, citizens of Rouen, English soldiers, and high-ranking clergy. They've come to witness the final act in a trial that was a sham from the very beginning. And then, she appears, Joan, just 19 years old. She's no longer in the armor of a warrior, but in a simple white dress, the garment of a condemned heretic. As she's led through the silent crowd, her head is shorn. This small, frail figure looks nothing like the terrifying which her enemies portrayed her as. She looks like what she is, a young girl, alone and facing an unimaginable fate. Her eyes scan the crowd. She sees fear, pity, and hatred. But her own expression is one of serene resolve. The verdict is read aloud, a long list of accusations: heresy, blasphemy, wearing men's clothes. It's all a political maneuver, a desperate attempt by the English and their Burgundian allies to discredit not just Joan, but the king she crowned, Charles VII. If they can prove she was sent by the devil, then Charles's coronation is illegitimate. The entire French cause would crumble. As she is tied to the stake, high above the crowd, Joan asks for a cross. An English soldier, perhaps moved by a flicker of compassion, quickly fashions one from 2 pieces of wood and hands it to her. She clutches it to her chest. She then calls out, asking for a processional cross from the nearby church to be held up so she can see it. Even in her final moments, her focus is on her faith. The clergy who condemned her stand by, their faces unreadable. The English soldiers, who once trembled at the mere mention of her name on the battlefield, now watch with a mixture of grim satisfaction and uneasy fear. The common people of Rouen, powerless to intervene, simply bear witness to the tragedy unfolding before them. As the executioner lights the pyre, the flames begin to lick at the wood. Joan's voice rises above the crackling fire. She doesn't scream in terror or curse her enemies. Instead, she calls out the name of Jesus over and over again. Her voice is strong, unwavering. She proclaims her love for God and her unwavering belief that her mission was divine. She forgives her accusers and prays for their souls. The crowd is completely silent, mesmerized by this display of incredible spiritual strength. The smoke billows, engulfing her, but her voice continues to cry out, a beacon of faith in the midst of the flames. She declares her innocence, her loyalty to France, and her certainty that she will be with God in paradise. It is a testament so powerful that it begins to sow seeds of doubt and awe even in the hearts of her enemies. As the fire consumes her, many in the crowd weep openly. The spectacle was meant to be a show of English power, a definitive end to the Siege of Orléans, but it's having the opposite effect. Instead of breaking the French spirit, it's sanctifying their hero. The English soldiers, who had hoped for a triumphant execution, start to look uneasy. Legends say that one English secretary exclaimed, "We are lost, for we have burned a saint." The fear that had once been their weapon against the French was now turning back on them. They feared they had not executed a heretic, but martyred a holy woman, inviting divine retribution. To ensure no relics could be collected by the French, to prevent her grave from becoming a shrine, the English ordered her ashes to be gathered and thrown into the Seine River. They wanted to erase her from existence, to make it as if she had never been. Her body was gone, scattered by the water, carried out to the sea. But in their attempt to destroy her, they achieved the exact opposite. They had tried to contain her, to define her as a witch, to reduce her to ash. But like the ashes that flowed down the Seine and into the wider world, her story could not be contained. The news of her martyrdom, of her courage and faith in the face of death, spread like wildfire. It didn't demoralize the French, it galvanized them. She became more powerful in death than she had ever been in life. Joan the woman was gone, but Joan the legend was just beginning. Her spirit became the rallying cry for the French armies. Her story inspired a renewed sense of national identity and purpose. The very soldiers who had fought alongside her now fought with a ferocity born of vengeance and righteous anger. The war would continue for another 2 decades, but the tide had irrevocably turned at Orléans, and her sacrifice at Rouen sealed it. In the years that followed, her name was cleared. A new trial, authorized by the Pope himself, was held in 1456. It posthumously overturned the verdict, declaring her innocent and acknowledging her as a martyr. The girl condemned as a heretic was officially recognized for what so many already believed her to be, a true servant of God. Her legacy grew far beyond the borders of France. She became a universal symbol of integrity, of standing up for your beliefs against impossible odds. She inspires artists, writers, and leaders to this day. From a simple peasant girl who couldn't read or write, she became a military commander, a kingmaker, and ultimately, a saint. Her body was destroyed, but her spirit endured. It lives on in the heart of France, in the annals of history, and in the countless people who look to her story and find the strength to fight their own battles, to hold on to their own faith, and to believe that one person, truly, can change the world. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey. The story of Joan of Arc is a powerful reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. If you found this story as moving as I do, please like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most fascinating figures. The fire that took Joan of Arc's life in Rouen did not end her story. It was only the beginning of her legend. In the years that followed that tragic day, the tide of the 100 Years' War turned decisively. The momentum Joan had created was unstoppable. French armies, filled with a renewed sense of purpose and belief, pushed the English back, step by step, city by city. The Dauphin she had crowned, King Charles VII, finally ruled over a unified and victorious France. The war that had raged for over a century was finally over, and France was free. But what of the girl who had made it all possible? Charles VII, perhaps moved by guilt or a sense of justice, ordered a new inquiry into Joan's trial. 25 years after her execution, the verdict was revisited. The finest legal and theological minds of the time examined the case. They reviewed the evidence, questioned the surviving witnesses, and scrutinized the procedures of that politically motivated court in Rouen. The conclusion was unanimous and undeniable. Joan of Arc was innocent. The original verdict was declared null and void, tainted by fraud, deceit, and heresy. Her name was officially cleared. This posthumous retrial was more than just a legal correction. It was the moment Joan of Arc began her transformation from a fallen soldier to a national hero. The people of France, who had already whispered her name with a mixture of awe and sorrow, could now celebrate her openly. She became a symbol of French patriotism, the peasant girl who spoke to God and saved the kingdom. Her story was told and retold in poems, plays, and songs. She was the Maid of Orléans, the savior of France. Her image, clad in armor and holding her banner high, became an enduring icon of French identity and resilience. Centuries rolled by, but Joan's legacy only grew stronger. Her story transcended the borders of France and the confines of history. She became a universal figure, admired not just for her military victories, but for her unwavering courage in the face of overwhelming power. She was a young woman who dared to defy the conventions of her time, who trusted her own convictions even when the entire world seemed aligned against her. Her faith was her shield, and her courage, her sword. This evolution from national hero to spiritual icon reached its zenith in the 20th century. The Catholic Church, which had once condemned her, now recognized the profound holiness of her life. After a long process of investigation into her virtues and the miracles attributed to her intercession, the moment finally arrived. On May 16, 1920, in a grand ceremony at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, Pope Benedict XV canonized her. Joan of Arc was officially declared a saint of the Catholic Church. The girl who was burned at the stake as a heretic was now venerated as Saint Joan. Today, her legacy is everywhere. You can find statues of her in countless towns and cathedrals across France, her gaze forever fixed on the horizon. Her story has inspired artists, writers, filmmakers, and leaders for generations. She represents the power of faith to move mountains and the strength of a single individual to change the course of history. She is a patron saint of soldiers and of France itself, a timeless symbol of resistance against tyranny, and a beacon of hope for anyone fighting for a cause they believe in. Her life reminds us that true strength doesn't come from a crown or a title, but from the fire of conviction within the human heart. Joan of Arc died at 19, but she saved a nation and inspired the world forever. Thank you for watching. If you found this story as moving as we did, please like, share, and subscribe for more chapters from history.
As we close this chapter of the Chrono Archives, remember, the past is never truly gone. It waits patiently in the shadows of forgotten ruins, in the echoes of ancient voices, and in the timeless lessons that still guide us today. It waits to be remembered by curious minds like yours. Thank you for joining us on this extraordinary journey through the annals of time. If today's exploration of lost civilizations, mythical legends, or historical enigmas ignited your passion for the past, hit that like button, drop a comment with your favorite moment or what you'd love to see next, and most importantly, subscribe to the Chrono Archives and continue the journey through time. Turn on notifications so you never miss an episode where we unearth buried secrets, decode ancient mysteries, and bring history's greatest stories back to life. Together, we'll keep the flame of the past burning bright. Until next time, fellow time travelers, keep questioning, keep discovering, and keep remembering. The Chrono Archives, where the past lives forever.